everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jenny and I'm here today to start my January 2026 reading wrap-up. So I had originally had this on my December TBR, Snowed In for Christmas by Sarah Morgan, and I did start it in December. I think I may have started it on the 29th or 30th and just finished it today, which is the 4th of January. So I thought I would include it in my January reading wrap-up, as my December one was already getting pretty long. So Sarah Morgan is a contemporary romance women's fiction writer, I would say. Her work is one, I just really like her books. I really like her books. I don't read a lot of romance, don't read a lot of contemporary women's fiction. But what I feel Sarah Morgan does so well is she really writes characters who have depth to them and personality. And this one, I have to say, is probably my second favorite after the Christmas Sisters of her Christmas books. I believe she writes a Christmas novel almost every year, so I still have several left that I haven't read of hers. This one is set in London and Scotland, and we're following the Miller family and a marketing professional named Lucy. And Lucy's company and the people she works with have lost two big accounts. It's almost Christmas, and that's causing a lot of stress on the company. And they all really care about each other and want to be able to continue working together. And so Lucy is traveling up from London to Scotland to work on another campaign. And while she's there, she decides that she's going to write a proposal and drop it off at the home of the Millers, one of whom, the son Ross, is owns a very promising sportswear company, and she's hoping that he will consider letting her company pitch for his marketing needs in the new year. And so the plot ensues from there. As you can discern by the title, there is a big snowstorm and no one's able to leave the Miller home, and the three Miller siblings are all very close and have been living in London, one of whom doesn't want to live in London anymore and has a pretty big reveal that she tells the family when she gets home for Christmas. The other sister is waffling on whether or not she is ready to marry her boyfriend. And so there's multiple plots. I think I also really enjoy in this one, which is similar to the Christmas Sisters. There's always like an older female matriarch character. In this book, there's actually two. There's the grandmother and the mother, both of whom really ground the story in this very homey, cozy, loving way. And so it makes the chaos of the children's lives, and these are children who are obviously in their late 20s and early 30s, a little bit less of the plot. It just gives the plot a bit more of a groundedness, which I really enjoy. So I think that that's a key element for me in her books that I really like, and I think when it's missing, in terms of one of the older women being the main character, they're not quite as successful for me. So this one is up there for me. I gave this one 5 stars, and that is my first read of January, and I will check in again with you when I have finished another book. Everybody, coincidentally, I finished 2 books today, and they had very similar vibes to them, so that was kind of interesting. But I'll start with the audiobook I was reading, which is called River of the Gods by Candice Millard. This book is about the search for the Nile, the source of the Nile River, by Richard Burton and John Hanning Speak, in the 1850s for the National Geographic Society. And I found it highly entertaining to listen to. The narrator did a really great job of like embodying the different cultures and voices, which I don't find people necessarily do very much in nonfiction when they're narrating. So I found that really nice and helpful, and adding a personification of the different people involved helped to kind of differentiate a lot of names, because inevitably in these kind of historical books there's a lot of names. And what I loved about the way the story was, the text was written, was that it felt like an adventure story. And so this absolutely incredible story of adventure, obviously layers of problematic things, so many problematic things when you're talking about a colonial narrative. But I thought, again, Candice Millard did a good job of illustrating the problems. So she was talking about, English, British explorers going into these different places and, treating the local guides and the local peoples with disrespect. That was something actually that Richard Burton didn't do as much, but later in his life, he did, play around with the idea of superior races and things like that. So both Richard Burton and John Henning Speak were problematic in the way that they looked at the white European and indigenous peoples of wherever they happened to be. Although Richard Burton very much tried to integrate himself into the cultures that he was studying. He learned languages very easily, and so he would adopt languages, he would adopt dress, he would adopt customs in order to make his travels more pleasant and to be respectful of the cultures for the most part. So the two of them were kind of brought together to do this first expedition. And the thing I think that was the most shocking about these expeditions is how sick these men got constantly, because they were, of course, being exposed to so many diseases and so many viruses that that their immune systems had no immunity to. So they would get very, very sick and have to be waylaid for weeks. They were running these expeditions with all these people and pack animals and trying to negotiate with tribes as they were traveling in order to try to find the source of the Nile, of the White Nile, as they said, because there's a source of the Blue Nile had already been found. Again, by Europeans. So we're talking about, potentially the cultures living around these lakes and rivers didn't really care where the source was. It wasn't something they were pursuing. But of course, in this idea of, mapping the world and adventure, these European men were vying for these titles. And there were also, lots of other explorers of the time mentioned, as well as, I thought in the epilogue was really great, a mention of the countless men of color, and I think some women were included in there, although she didn't mention them, who were also kind of out there mapping Everest, mapping, creating, showing the world where these places were. And that process was not just done by white men. There were countless local people and people from different parts of the world who were going into different areas of Asia and Africa and creating maps. So it was I found it very interesting. I found the John Henning Speak's character, or him as a person, to be deplorable. He was a terrible person. He never took responsibility for anything. He really, I think, was harsh to Richard Burton unfairly. He got his just desserts in the end, not because of his untimely death, but because of his eventual treatment by the Geographic Society, who realized that he was kind of an opportunist and he wasn't actually as accomplished in being an explorer as they had said. Anyway, it's a really fascinating book. because of the way it was written. She just wrote it in a very adventure forward manner. And I found it really interesting to learn about that time and the motivations and the extreme lengths that these people would go to pursue these dreams and pursue these goals to their own detriment most of the time. So quite interesting. And so along that vein, I've also read this month A Woman in the Polar Night by Christiane Ritter, translated from the German by, where is her name going to be? Jane Degras. Okay, so I also loved this. This is a beautiful memoir of the year that Christiane Ritter spent on Svalbard. At the time that she was there, it was called Spitsbergen, with her husband, living in the ice. And when I say living in the ice, like that is what they were doing, okay? They were living in a shack. There's a picture of it in here. And the way she approached, I don't know how well you can see that, but the way they approached life on Svalbard, the most northern island, habitable island. I mean, it's questionable whether it's habitable. You're living with polar bears, you're living with seals and foxes. So this was the winter of 1933. And Christiane, who's Austrian, goes to live with her husband, who's already been living in Svalbard for a very long time because he's a hunter. So, before you read this, I would caution you, if you struggle with harm to animals, I wouldn't really recommend this because, this was a culture of hunting. They hunted polar bears, they hunted seals, they hunted foxes, they hunted birds, and they lived off of the meat that they were shooting. And then they also were selling the foxes skins for women in Europe to wear around their necks. So there's no apology for that here. So if that is something that bothers you and you don't want to read about it, then really don't read this book. It's too bad though, because you would be missing out on some absolutely fantastic nature writing. Christiane Ritter only wrote this one book in her life. She is a visual artist for the rest of her life, but her writing is absolutely stunning. I couldn't believe how amazing her writing was, and especially as it was translated from the German. I just couldn't imagine, what a great writer, and it's just too bad that this is all she wrote because she just wrote so beautifully. So I did mark 2 spots so that I could kind of give you a taste for the writing. Okay, so this section is about Mikkel, who was one of the foxes, the Arctic foxes that they encountered, and he actually did not get trapped. So he was a clever guy and he got away. And so I'm going to, so Mikkel now demonstrates his attachment to us by sleeping close to the hut throughout the night. He lies curled up on his bed of straw with his bushy brush over his nose. The sleeping, shining white fox fits in wonderfully with the stillness of the night, which remains magically bright. Mikkel is like a fragment of the mysterious ice age, lying hidden in the frozen, quiet brightness. In the transparent heavens, the large moon looks quite near, not as it does in Europe, where its light is cold and distant. Here, it belongs to our world, the luminous picture of a sharply outlined ice landscape. So that's one example of the writing. And the other one is just one sentence. But this is very typical of how she writes this book. she's giving description of the landscape, and she says, "The immense silence of the land surrounds me and invades me, submerging and annihilating my human smallness." So, like, the way that this experience affected her and the way she became close to the North Pole, to Svalbard, and this ice landscape, the Arctic, is quite impressive. And the endurance that they had to live in these conditions where they were, getting snowed in and having to dig themselves out of this tiny cabin, walking for days, hours in, minus 35, from one cabin to another to check traps, and like living off of, meat as your vitamin source, and like things like that. Like, it was so fascinating to read and so well written, and such an interesting way to think about life. And the connection to nature was very much talked about in here. So this is the 1930s, and she's talking about how Europeans aren't connected to nature, and that nature is like the primal source for everyone. And, I can't, she was very much, poo-pooed by a lot of people, thinking that she couldn't manage this, that she wouldn't be able to endure being away from, European civilization for so long, living in a cabin with two men. She actually was there with her husband and also a friend who lived there most of the time with them. But she fully embraced it. It's a fascinating story. So I would highly recommend this one. I think both River of the Gods and A Woman in the Polar Night were just really excellent adventure stories, and I would highly recommend you picking them up if you enjoy adventure stories. All right, I'll check in again when I finish another book. Hey everyone. So I just finished Crow Winter by Karen McBride. This is a novel about a young woman, Hazel Ellis, who moves back to her First Nation after finishing school in the kind of big city. And it's set in Eastern Canada, or in Quebec and Ontario, right at the border between Quebec and Ontario, which is an area of the country that I'm pretty familiar with. And I grew up in Quebec, so it was really nice to read a First Nation author from that part of the world. I don't really know a lot of other ones. If you know of any, please let me know. So this story centers around Hazel as she is grieving her father, who has passed away from cancer. Her mother's also grieving. Her brother still lives in the city. And she's trying to find her place. So she goes and starts working at the reserve office, the First Nation office, and she's sorting through a lot of old papers. And part of the process of this, she discovers a secret that her father had kept, and also some questionable land ownership around a quarry that's very close to her home. And a young guy who's the descendant of a former Indian agent who worked on the reserve comes in and tries to create a development in a certain part of this reserve on land that they believed to be owned by them. And so a kind of mystery unfolds around that land. And there's a spiritual element to this story as well, because Nana Bush, who is the trickster in Anishinaabe culture, is visiting Hazel and kind of trying to move her towards protecting this land for a very specific reason. And so Hazel has to kind of come to that on her own, and she has to figure out how she's going to do this, and she has to like find the strength within herself to question authority and all these things. So that is what this story is about. And it's also about the bonds between family and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really well written. It's you know, it's very readable. It's not something that's complicated language, but it was, I thought, really well handled, and I cared about what was happening to the characters and wanted to know what would happen next. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. Hi everybody. Okay, so I've potentially just finished my last book of January. I'm not exactly sure if I'll finish the other one I'm currently reading before the end of the month. I think there's 4 days left. But I finished Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss. And I came away, I have very complex feelings about this book. And before I get into the way I feel about it, I want to just put a caveat in here that I was simultaneously reading Searching for Mercy Street by Linda Gray Sexton while reading Ghost Wall. And there are a lot of parallels. This is a memoir / biography and about a childhood, and this one is about a teenager who is living in an abusive situation. And so I think reading them at the same time was challenging because it was a lot of a similar feeling, and so I think that makes this book, it might have been unfair to my reading experience of this book because it felt like I was just going from violent situation to violent situation. That being said, I really don't feel like so this book came out in 2018 and it was on the Women's Prize for Fiction shortlist, and I was going to look up the other books that were on there with it, and I forgot to do that. But I heard so many people talk about this book at the time, and I don't remember anyone really explaining the violence in this story. It's a very violent story, and the violence and the abuse it's undermining, it's underneath, it's a tension that is there to me through the whole story, and I found it very uncomfortable the whole way through. So I think that's really important as a caveat if you're considering reading this book. It's a very uncomfortable story, and if you've experienced emotional or physical abuse, I would like to just put a trigger warning on there for you because I found it quite triggering, and I have not experienced that type of abuse. There are a lot of themes in here. This is a 130-page book. Sarah Moss is obviously a very thoughtful and deep writer, and she can bring up a lot of themes in a very short period of time that are very compelling and interesting. For me, though, what I took away from this book was a deep sense of discomfort around violence, around men's violence towards women, and about a kind of systemic acceptance of that, and how it is, how violence is catching. It's something that people permit and people justify. And I did listen to an interview between Jen Campbell and Sarah Moss, and that was something that came up, this idea that we tell ourselves stories in order to remove the humanness of something. Violence is something that we allow based on stories we tell about the person who's we're putting the violence against. And that is certainly Bill, who is okay, sorry. I'll give you a brief synopsis if you don't know the synopsis of this. A family of 3, a mother and a father and a teenage daughter, go and spend 2 weeks with a archaeological experimental class. And so they're going to live in the wilderness as people did in the Iron Age, with a professor, 2 male students, and a female student. They are meant to live rough, live as if they did in the Iron Age, eat as if they did in the Iron Age. But there's like a kind of fun aspect to it that is put forward by the professor that is not there for the father, Bill. Because Bill is, and again, the class structure of England is very much a subject in here. And because I'm not British, I don't see class that in that same thing, but it's there, and I did notice it. It's just not something that I understand probably to the extent that this other person does, that Sarah Moss does, that if you were coming from Britain, you would understand. So he's a bus driver, but he has this personal interest. He's an amateur historian, personally interested in the Iron Age and the bog and how people were put into the bog. He's also, as I said, a violent man, and he runs his household with an iron fist. He is abusive, verbally and physically, towards his wife and his daughter. Both of them are very much in the pattern of women who are abused, where they do their best at all times to try to prevent him from going off, try to prevent him from getting angry, try to prevent him trying to prevent anyone from insulting him, because if they do, he will take it out on the wife and the daughter. And this comes up multiple times in the narrative where other people insult him, and she knows, Sylvie has an inner dialogue, that she is now going to get it. She's going to be his punching bag, essentially, for any emotional slight that he feels he's experienced. This tension is throughout, like I said, throughout the whole novel. Some people seem to not notice the abusive parts at the beginning, or not find them disturbing as much as I did, I guess, and enjoyed this first part of the novel more. And then as the novel kind of descends into a more bleak perspective, they didn't like that part. I don't see how you could have enjoyed any of that. It's very obvious to me the whole time what was going to happen and how it was going to play out. And I thought Sarah Moss had a very complex and interesting way of showing that through the story. But it was really, really difficult to read and very uncomfortable to be in this woman's body and her mind and know that she is, there's a really interesting part of the book where they talk about the things they would throw in the bog. And maybe this is a spoiler. So if you don't want a mild spoiler, then don't listen to this part. But people are talking about the things that are most precious to them, and what they would throw in the bog. And she has this realization that her father would throw her in the bog. And he's a man who loves his daughter, but the twistedness of the love based through the violence and the abuse is so uncomfortable, and so it's not endearing. I felt no endearment towards Bill the whole time. I felt he was controlling, difficult. He's not only controlling them through physical and emotional abuse, he's also controlling their food, he's controlling their actions, he's controlling every single thing that they do. He is dictating and he is telling them about. It feels, she's always in fear if she deviates in any way from what he believes she should be doing. And that's just a really uncomfortable novel to read for me. I found it very challenging to read. There was an underlying beauty of the women coming together as Sylvie is able to see through another female character, one of the students, Molly, this kind of a different example of a woman. So a woman who is living in her own terms, who is not afraid. That was really important for Sylvie to see and to understand. And it is something she admires. And there's also a burgeoning, sexuality coming out of Sylvie. And Molly is the catalyst for that. And that's really important. There's also a lack of the men saying anything or calling out or noticing the abuse. So they just go along. They just go along for their game, and they let this man, Bill, terrorize his wife and daughter, subjugate them with no calling out, no questioning. One of the characters at one point near the end questions what's happening, and asks Sylvie if she's okay and if she wants to do this. And Sylvie is has been trained to obey her father, so there's no question that she's going to do what he wants her to do. It's a very complex book. There's a lot in a really small package. Don't know if it's got something to do with the state of the world currently, the kind of blatant violence that's happening all around us all the time. But I just found it really hard to read it, and very. I can only compare it to Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, which was my top book of 2025. And she also handles an abusive father in that story. And the way she talks about the abuse in that book versus the way Sarah Moss did it in this book, for me, it was better handled in that book. You have to be, it's only, I guess, because in Hamnet, the abusive father figure is only a portion of the story. He's not the main character. For me, the power of Sylvie's personality was always being overshadowed by her father's abuse, and her father's domineering, personality took over this novel for me. It was so huge and big, and this big shadow that covered the rest of the novel. So it took away a lot of the enjoyment of it, if there could have been enjoyment for me. So I guess that's where I end with Ghostwall. And I'm pretty sure this is going to be my last finish of January, but if it's not, you will see another clip after this.
Hi everybody. So I did end up finishing one last book in January, on the last day of January, and that is Searching for Mercy Street, My Journey Back to My Mother and Sexton by Linda Gray Sexton. Okay. This is a very complex book, and so it's going to be a little challenging to wrap it up in just a few minutes of talking about it. It is very much a triggering book for all the trigger warnings you could think of. So physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, substance abuse, mental illness, mother-daughter relationships, dysfunctional families, also a portrait of a brilliant poet, and Sexton was a brilliant poet, but an example of an artist who is very complex and did a lot of bad things. So she was a great poet, potentially a terrible mother. And this is Linda Gray's reckoning of her childhood and what she went through as a child in relationship to her mother, how she loved her mother, recognized her mother's brilliance, but was in a lot of ways terrorized by her mental illness her entire life. So from the time that Linda was born, her mother struggled to fulfill the role of wife and mother, and also become a poet and find a way of self-expression. She was very much unflinching. She used her life as her inspiration for her poetry. She exposed, very personal and difficult things. She was uninhibited with her children, and that was inappropriate and scarred them for life. And Linda Gray also talks about how her upbringing and the way she was mothered influences the way she is as a mother with her own children. So there's a lot in here. It's very complex. It's not an easy read. It's quite harrowing and difficult and sickening and hard to believe that someone could do that to their children, to their partner, to their friends. She and Sexton struggled not only with mental health but with alcoholism. She made numerous suicide attempts. She craved success but also was agoraphobic. She she was a very, very complex and layered woman, and that manifested itself in many ways. She went through decades of psychotherapy and psychiatry treatments. She recorded all those sessions. All of those sessions are in a public library or in a library collection where people can go and read them and listen to them. And Sexton believed that her work was informed by everything about her. So, this was, I think, a very well-written book. I think Linda Gray Sexton was very brave in a lot of ways to share this type of information. Some people think it's wrong of her to share it. She had family members that didn't like the fact that some of the information was shared in Anne Sexton's biography, which Linda Gray authorized. But again, Linda Gray Sexton felt she was honoring her mother's wishes. Her mother made her literary executor, so the person who was in control of all of her work, her papers, and her personal papers after her death. And Sexton committed suicide in, I believe it was 1974, when Linda was 21. And so there's a lot of information in here. It is not easy to read, but I did find it absolutely fascinating and important, I think, for documenting the fact that you can have a really harrowing childhood and a really difficult relationship with a parental figure, and you can still find, and some people can still find, strength and beauty and forgiveness and love within that, despite the fact that the relationship is difficult and despite the fact that the relationship was not not clear cut and not fully reconciled. It was very fascinating in that sense. So that is Searching for Mercy Street by Linda Gray Sexton. That's my final book of January, and I will be back again soon with another video. Thank you so much for watching.